Hey everyone, this is the second guide. It's going to be about the depth charge Yeti crab build, obviously for Vanessa. Once the sort of underwater pack got released for Vanessa, I think this became a build I went to quite a bit. And as I was working on this guide, actually, like 3 of the items got buffed. I believe depth charge, Yeti crab, and even dive weights got buffed, and significantly, like the cooldown on depth charge and the poison on Yeti crab. So it's very strong right now, and I think it's a really good build for people to learn. It's actually been probably my main build, sort of overtaking the single weapon build that I had started out with. So what's the build about? So elemental depth charge is sort of the carry of the build, or the focal point, I guess, and it's at silver, it takes 12 seconds, and it has multicast for each aquatic item you have. So it's usually going to be casting like 7 to 8 times, and it does some amount of. It starts at like 4/4, I think, but it does poison, burn, and it freezes a medium or small item for 1 second. Now, obviously, poison and burn is some great damage, especially if you can stack it. This is a very slow item, so the damage isn't starting off too great. But the freeze is really interesting. One of the interesting things about this item is that it triggers so many effects. So any of your poison, any of your things that trigger off poison is going to be triggered. Same with burn, same with freeze. And that brings us to the Yeti crab. When you freeze, adjacent poison items get +2 poison. So if you put a Yeti crab next to the depth charge, it will increment the poison on each cast. And by the end of the depth charge's many casts, it will have done quite a bit of poison, and its poison count will be quite high. So if you get to a subsequent cast, it's going to be even bigger. It has huge ramping damage, and it's very, very powerful. And it also will slow down your enemies by freezing multiple items, freezing medium and small items. There is a little bit of a weakness against large items. If you're going against like a single weapon large item, that can be sort of a weak spot for this build, but honestly the damage is so high it rarely comes up. So the fact that this is just a 2-card combo makes this super easy to force and super easy to pivot into. It just doesn't require a lot. It's not super, like, you need the depth charge to play this build, this depth charge build. But you usually need the crab, you don't always, but you can just sort of pivot into it very quickly. As soon as you see these 2 items, pivot into it, and then just, incrementally increase its damage throughout the game. The strength of this build is, as I said, it's very easy to pivot into. It utilizes a huge range of skills, right? Anything with poison, anything with burn, anything with aquatic, a lot of things with ammo as well are going to be good. The only things that aren't really good are weapon-specific stuff, although you can get some use out of weapon-specific skills. It, just uses some of the skills that you really don't get to use on like a weapon-focused Vanessa, especially the poison stuff and the burn stuff. And those include a lot of haste and charge skills, which are going to be really important in terms of getting this fast enough to compete with, the other builds. It's very flexible. You basically have, 2 slots, or 2 items, 3 board slots locked, and then you can basically play anything else. You want to play aquatic items to some extent, but you really have a lot of leeway into what you want to play. It's sort of a pseudo one-shot build. It can, it's not like trying to ramp up so much as it's trying to get a cast of depth charge off, and once it does, it's usually going to win. And even if that doesn't necessarily win, it will accelerate itself to another charge, using Zorkit a lot of the time, or lock them down so you can get another charge. So it's a build that sort of wins when you get one charge off, which gives it an edge over some of the ramping builds that are going to be a lot slower and have sort of a slower, starting time. And obviously the poison really beats shield builds. Shield builds haven't been super common, but I have seen them coming back a little bit in terms of like pig builds. So getting under the shield with a ton of poison can be really helpful. How to get into the build? Very, very simple. This is the simplest build I think you can find. It's you buy a crab early. There's a lot of early shops. You're going to see a crab. Sometimes I pick an enchanted crab just off the beginning. You find the depth charge, and that's the whole thing. You can put almost anything else that says aquatic in the rest of your board and have a perfectly reasonable 10-win build. I've done it with almost anything. It really doesn't matter. The other items are mostly there to say aquatic, at least for the mid game, until you try to really optimize it towards the end game to make that final push. People always, when they see something like depth charge that has one ammo, they really worry about ammo. I would say don't worry about ammo. If you have a crab in particular, you're going to do enough poison on one cast most of the time. If you're scaling at a normal rate, like if you get this depth charge at a normal time, middle, for like days 4 or 5, type something like that. I believe you can start seeing silver items on day 2, but it's unlikely. So you're probably, not getting a depth charge till days 3, 4, 5. So if you have that in, say, just a silver crab, silver depth charge, by the time it goes off, it will usually do enough damage with one cast. You don't have to worry about it. The second thing is, it's a 12-second cast. Even if you had 2 ammo, you're asking both you and your opponent to survive till 24 seconds, plus more time for the poison to tick them down. So that's just not something that happens a ton. There obviously are instances of that, but it's not something to worry about. If you have 2 ammo, you'll almost always be fine. There are some very rare fights where, you'll do 2 shots. Remember, the crab keeps ramping, so the second cast depth charge is going to do even more poison than the first one. And at that point, your opponent really, unless they have some pretty wild healing or regen build, is probably just going to be ticking down very, very quickly. So you don't really need that much ammo. Getting 2 is great, I think. I like having that. Getting 3, at that point, I'm like, this is more than enough. I generally sometimes, even if I get gunpowders in the future, I'm going to put them on like dive weights just to get a little bit of extra utility. And people think about like cannonball or incendiary rounds. I think that's usually a waste, especially because I think you want your adjacent, the slots adjacent to dive weights for either crabs. Like you could even put a second crab, or sometimes some items speed it up, whether it's reducing its cooldown or it's giving a charge or haste or something like that. So I really don't think you need to worry too much about ammo. There are a few ammo things that are helpful. The ammo stash from the Blood Reef Raider, day 3 PvE encounter, completely takes care of your ammo problems, as does the gunner skill, which you can get from Hoverbike Hooligan and also just from the ammo vendor, C4. I don't know if you can ammo stash from the ammo vendors either. You almost always, I think, see gunner if you go to the ammo vendor and reroll once. I think just the number of ammo items there are, you seem very, very likely to do it. And then also gunpowder, which can drop from several PvEs. That's the one that's the loot item. If you sell it, your leftmost one gets, 1, 2, or does it get up to 3? I don't know if it gets up to 3. So it gets some amount of extra ammo. Preening Duelist has it. Hoverbike Hooligan, who also has the gunner, obviously, in the Hacrovian Rocket Trooper, also has it, and also you can get it as a level up forward on 6, 9, and 15. So, I think that's all you need to know about ammo. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think it's something that people just, when they see ammo items, I think it's more of a big deal when you have ammo items that don't have poison, because poison can keep ticking, whereas other items that like sometimes fire too fast just won't build up enough damage, like a torpedo or something. You sort of have to weigh, how fast you're ramping some of those items. So, in the early game, what are you doing, right? I'm picking up crabs, and I'm trying to, if I see like a B1, B2, get it to silver. Obviously, if you can get it higher, do that, but, use those upgrades on crab. That's the most important thing you can get from bronze to silver in this build. Obviously, depth charge just comes at silver. If I have another option, and I don't really have anything I want to upgrade, I will upgrade a fishing rod, because fishing rod can give you basically the entire build. It can give you crabs, obviously, it can give you clams, but it can also just give you small aquatic items, which are going to be the focus of this build. It'll also give you dive weights. Just play your strongest board early. You don't have to play there's no, you get depth charge late enough that you don't really need to play a miniature version of this build. Your board is usually the full 10 slots by the time you get it. I like to hold feathers and wings, insect wings, early if possible. Reducing the cooldown on dive weights is really important. Unless you think it's going to change the fight, just hold those if you happen to pick them up. Grab some dive weights and clamors if you see them. Clamor is just so good in so many builds. And other than that, you're just focusing on econ, XP, and HP, like pretty much any other build. So just, focus on playing your strongest board, getting your econ up, and then, look for opportunities to pivot into, focus on some crabs and small aquatic items. But don't just pick up random aquatic items if you don't need them. Sometimes, you play stuff like a catfish early, and that can transition, but that's really not going to be part of your final build usually, so don't worry too much about that. In terms of filling out the board, you don't usually need a second damage item. A lot of people like to, try to sneak in a jellyfish or a catfish or a pufferfish or something. I don't think you need those most of the time. Your fishing rod can basically give you the whole board. Dive weights is great for setting up combos. That's the one that's the multicast with haste. You can get some combos with some of the ammo skills and some of the haste stuff. So that's generally a good one to have. Anything that's speeding up your build is going to be better than something that's just adding incremental damage. Defensive items are very weak right now. I don't think heal and shield are very good, especially since I think they just are kind of slow a lot of the time. And one-shotting is just so common. Going over the top of those things is so common that I don't think you want to be playing like seaweeds a lot of the time. Sorry, I skipped over clam, but clam is OP. Grab clam all the time. The reason it's OP, obviously, is it triggers at the start of the fight. It's the first thing that will trigger, which is very, very good. The slow is also good. You can ramp the slow, too, with some curio items, but just trigger at the beginning of the fight interacts with a lot of skills in ways that are important. And remember, we're focusing on speed, and we're focusing on disruption. We're not doing defense. We're just trying to make sure our depth charge goes off as soon as possible. And this is sort of what we're getting at. Speed is more important than damage. You don't need to put crabs on either side to maximize the damage. If you can instead maybe just make it go off, the depth charge go off a little faster. Generally, the left and right of the depth charge is going to be a crab plus a speed item. Sometimes it's a Zorsid, which is the gives haste. It increments up. It charges up when stuff burns. Or it's like a rowboat, or it's some kind of cooldown reduction. Disruption. Ooh, did I spell that? I don't think I spelled that. Is greater than defense right now. The fish things are generally traps. Silver crab is okay for a lot of the game. Definitely upgrade it if you can, but you don't have to go digging for crab. The depth charge upgrade is key, because that brings down the cooldown from 12 to 10 to 8. And once you get it to 8, and then you reduce it further with some skills or some loot items or some other items that reduce aquatic stuff, that's going to be like the key. Is getting that trigger off. Like when your depth charge goes off is when your build sort of comes to life and things are going to start ramping. So getting that number down as low as possible. Like if when you're looking at your build and want to evaluate it, the lower that number is going to, inversely correlate with the power level, right? So getting that low is going to mean a much higher power level. And depth charge doesn't enchant super well a lot of the time. There are some good ones, like shield or healing can be good because the poison takes a little bit of time to tick, getting yourself those extra seconds. You don't win on the cast, you win a couple seconds later. So unlike a single weapon build that's trying to one-shot, where the heal doesn't actually matter because it's going to kill the enemy immediately. The heal can be good. Getting extra toxin can be good. Extra burn, fiery enchant is okay. Some damaged enchants are okay. Radiant is very good. If, there's a lot of slow and freeze going around, so Radiant's always pretty good. Sort of a nice safety net. Make sure you don't get just completely bricked by an enemy build. So if you see an enchant, you don't have to put it on your depth charge. You can put it on some of your support items, and obviously there's a very individualized, but there's going to be some that are a lot better. So just keep an eye out for whereas a single weapon usually you want, if you have a random enchant, you usually want to try to put it on that weapon because there's so many that upgrade the damage in such a significant way. Depth charge I don't think is the same way. And getting a bunch of slows when the depth charge goes off, it just doesn't seem that important when you're also shooting off a bunch of freezes, it doesn't seem to be that important on the margin. Let's talk about the key vendors, right? You have Colt. Colt is the ammo vendor. this is going to sell our depth charge and our dive weight. Obviously very important. Day one, you're not going to see the silver items, so you don't need to go to him there. And he is a 4 cost reroll, so just be a little careful. Make sure you have some gold going in, because depth charge is going to cost at least 8. So I wouldn't go there unless you have like 12, because you really want to see if you can, find the depth charge. You want to take these opportunities at these shops and not waste them. Sylvia, similar thing. It's going to sell depth charge and silver items. Also, I believe a 4 cost reroll. Silver items are always going to be expensive, but more expensive, so make sure you're managing your economy. Nautica is all aquatic items, which is your entire build. Everything that you're looking for is going to be there. It does sell a wider variety of things than you want, but you can make use of most aquatic items just on the margin, so going to Nautica is usually pretty safe. Mittel sells the depth charge and figurehead. Figurehead is one of the best support items because it's going to lower the cooldown. So at some point in the game, you're probably going to want to check out a few middles, just get those depth charges. Kina also sells everything we want. We really don't want any weapons. The only weapons we play in, say, the average build is going to be a Zorsid, who is the little eel again. Andy sells everything but depth charge. We're looking for mostly small aquatic items, and this sells all small items, not necessarily aquatic, but, we'll find stuff we need there. And C4 sells ammo skills, particularly gunner is the one we're generally looking for. If you want to go from 1 to 2 ammo, I would say this is sometimes a decent buy. Again, I wouldn't focus too much on ammo, so you don't need to go there. But if you think you need that second ammo, C4 is where you get it. And you can avoid Pole, who is selling the large items, and Ayla, who sells weapons, because you're really not using any large items at all in this build. I'd say 90% of the time I have no large items. There are some rare exceptions, but I even the ones I use, I wouldn't go out of my way for. And Ayla, again, the only weapon we use is Zorsid. It's not essential, and nothing else. You're not going to use anything else, so don't go searching for the one item. Let's look at some variations of the build. I think this top one we have is probably the most standard, right? It's a figurehead. It's a depth charge. Next to the crab in the depth charge in the Zorsid, a sort of a, a 3-card combo. Again, you don't need Zorsid, but it's sort of one of the options. And figurehead is a great support item, and then the rest is sort of just filler. I do have a catfish in this. You do not need that. Again, it's usually skill dependent. It's usually if you have skills that target poison items, you might not want other poison items in because you want to make sure you're hitting those on your depth charge. So this is probably the most standard version, not necessarily the specifics of it, but just the, crab, depth charge, a bunch of small items, then a figurehead. Obviously, I'm leaning towards Clamras, I'm leaning towards Zorsids, leaning towards dive weights, because those all accelerate. We're looking for accelerate and disrupt. Disruption from the Clamras, acceleration from everything else. Next one, we see a rowboat in there. Sometimes, rowboat obviously can accelerate you. One of the good things about rowboat is if you get, I think it's the command vehicle skill, which reduces all the cooldowns by 20% if you have a vehicle. Rowboat is one that obviously already will, give you charge, and it's giving you cooldown reduction in this case. Then you see I just have the crab, and I have the depth charge, and that's, basically the build. I have a couple defensive items in here. Like I said, those I don't think are optimal, but sometimes you just have them in because you don't have any other small aquatic items. And then the last one I think is the most, more of a variation. Sometimes you can use Iceberg to give you the ramp, because you can, the crab triggers off the depth charge, which is the combo. It also triggers off its own cast. The crab does do something. It does freeze an item. It's just kind of slow. But it also triggers off Iceberg cast. So if you get an Iceberg, usually I don't go searching for it, but if I get one, an Iceberg is also aquatic, so we still do have 6 casts here. That's one of the problems with large items is you get fewer slots, which means depth charge is going to have fewer casts. And although you don't need to maximize depth charge casts, you still want to not neglect that, especially because the later casts are going to do more because they're going to be ramping with the crab. So yeah, Iceberg will make sure, is disruption, and will charge up your depth charge even before it gets its first cast off, so it can lead to doing a lot of damage and sort of make up for the lack of multicast there. One thing to consider is you need to know the meta. If the meta is people doing single items, single shot things where Iceberg isn't going to help at all, you don't want to play it if it's not going to provide a lot of disruption. If you're playing against people who are rapid firing and this is going to trigger a lot and ramp you up, then obviously it's amazing. So really, just pay attention to what you're going against, and that will tell you if this is like a worthwhile variation. I do like this variation a lot, and I think if you see an Iceberg and you have the crab and the depth charge, I think this is worth exploring in a lot of cases. Here's a couple of the weirder ones. And I think these first two are interesting to look at because this is sort of depth charge as a non-carry item, particularly the second build, right? We don't even have the crab in, you'll see. And this is sort of set up just to trigger the Slumbering Primordial, because of course that one triggers off, it gains damage and charges by 1 or 2 seconds. You really want the diamond Slumbering Primordial if you go for that. Every time you poison, burn, freeze, and I think there's one more condition, but I don't actually know what it is. And obviously depth charge is going to do all three, which means that once you cast a depth charge, your Primordial is going to stack damage and trigger just, pretty constantly on every charge. You see that we even use incendiary rounds and dive weights. We're getting a lot of burn triggers off, those things triggering because we're using ammo items. And we're just basically going, instead of saying we're going to kill them with poison damage from depth charge, we're trying to kill them with, just attack damage from Primordial. The top build is in a similar situation. This one I actually, played recently, and I just happened to find a Diamond Obsidian Powder Keg, which will do 100% of your opponent's max health. And obviously Powder Keg increments by 2 seconds off a burn. So I decided to focus on using that as extra damage, cutting down on my depth charge casts a little bit, but making sure that whenever it went off, it also triggered for 100% of my opponent's max health. Obviously pretty strong. And yeah, so these are sort of variations where depth charge is more of the support item because it has so many triggers. Usually it's sort of being a carry item and a support item for itself. It's providing ramping damage for itself, which is sort of an interesting little quirk of it. But in this case, you can use it to buff other items. And this last build is just a little bit different because we have like a battery. If you ever get a battery, you can really lean into this build and just go super hard on trying to accelerate the depth charge. And that's, so one of the non-aquatic items we're willing to play is it's just so strong. So if you happen to get a battery, that's something you're going to lean into as well. And as you can see, the rest of the items are pretty incidental, right? Seaweed, pearl, and I guess I must have started with an obsidian ambergris, which I probably should have just sold off at some point. So yeah, I mean, those are some just variations. Again, there's so many varieties of this because it's really only focused on those 3 slots, the crab and the depth charge. So everything else is sort of just up in the air. And then I just want to discuss individual items. Fishing rod, I love to get early because it can give you basically all the items you need for this build minus the depth charge. And it's just a fine econ item. You pay 4 for it, for the bronze version. It sells for 2, and it will give you 1 gold worth of something every day. So it pays for itself in a couple days. If you have room, if you have money, I think this is a great pickup early. And then if it, finds you Zorsids, Clamras, it can find you ambergrisses, which helps your econ later. It can find you dive weights. It just finds everything. Really great one. Iceberg, I did talk about this a little bit before, but I think this is a nice variation. If you're playing against a lot of, heavy casting, a lot of accelerated builds, I think Iceberg, Crab, Depth Charge is a great combo. Zorsid is really excellent. I touched on this briefly, but basically it pastes the items next to it, and it itself gains a charge whenever you burn. So if you put it next to a Depth Charge, it has a 6-second cooldown compared to Depth Charge's 8 at max level. So it will go off a little sooner, even if you have a figurehead, which is sort of reducing them by the same percentage. So it can accelerate the first cast a little bit, but where it gets really good is we'll then start basically perma-hasting your Depth Charge. So if you're playing a build that wants to get multiple casts off, this can be a great support item. I play this, I'd say, maybe like 50% of the time, I'm going to have a Zorsid as my support item, in addition to the crab on the other side. Again, I did talk about Clamor, but I think this is just such an amazing and underlooked card, or item, I guess. Being able to trigger at the start of the fight means you go off before anybody else. It triggers a bunch of skills. It provides some slow. A lot of disruptive items, including some I'll talk about later, just don't go off before your ramped depth charge will. And this is true of even like single weapon builds when you try to look for disruptive items. Some of the disruptive stuff is just kind of slow. Claymore doesn't have that problem. It's slow after its first cast, I guess. But it's just so good. I think keep an eye out for these. Really pay attention. It actually, it upgrades really well too. So, this is something I think I'm sure good players already know. I think good players probably already, are buying this. But I think there's some people who just look at it and think it doesn't do much. And I think that's probably wrong. Figurehead, obviously, it's basically just used to reduce all your cooldowns by 10, 20, or 30%. Getting it to that 20 or 30 is really important. I think there are probably some cases where this is a more important upgrade than the depth charge even, if you have good enough support items. I think usually depth charge is going to take priority on your upgrades. And remember, there's some key upgrade times I should have mentioned earlier. But level 7, you can upgrade a silver to a gold. In level 13, you can upgrade any item, including a gold to a diamond. So those are 2 key points. If you hit those levels, that you might be able to upgrade your figureheads or your depth charge. Because depth charge, it is hard to find, a diamond depth charge sometimes, and you really do want to get it there. So if you can get a depth charge before level 7 and get that upgrade to gold, that's huge. And then day 13, really make sure you're utilizing that on the proper items. And powder keg and slumber memorial, I just talked about a little bit, but those are going to be sort of alternative win conditions if we want to play a more supportive depth charge. And those fit in based on usually powder keg. I want to find it enchanted, and I'll go for it. And you really need it to be diamond. That needs upgrades and enchants. Slumbering Primordial, as long as it's diamond, I think it's usually worth it. I've had a lot of success with it. Dive weights, that's just an acceleration item. It has some cool combos with ammo skills, particularly I think heated shells. You're going to be incrementing ammo anyway, so sometimes dive weights, and it throws out a lot of haste, which can work out with some of the other stuff. Dive weights, I think, there's a lot of slots you need to fill up. I think dive weights is going to be one of the things you go towards more often. Ambergris is an amazing econ item. It just adds up really quickly. It's small, it's aquatic. I have it in a lot of the game, just on my board, because I want the extra aquatic items. I'd pick these up early almost anytime I see them, because they almost always pay for themselves pretty quickly. And then, what is this? Life Preserver. Life Preserver obviously takes 2 slots. It is aquatic. This is pretty broken early game. If you just have a silver Life Preserver, it's going to basically double your HP pool in the early game. And then, you can keep it in as you have the dive weight. It does, sort of take away 1 multicast if you usually have 2 slots. But until you get a better item, I keep this in, transitioning out of my early game build into my final build. I do keep this in for a little bit. And then once it doesn't burn anymore, sell it off. Just some items I think you should probably avoid. And not that these are bad, just they don't necessarily fit in the build. Like Catfish, I think, is a good early game item a lot of the time. If you have a way to haste it, it can just carry you through the first 3 days. 3 or 4 days, it ramps pretty well. It can definitely be its own build too. You can play carry Catfish. I have some interesting, especially if you get enchanted ones early. Catfish is, I think, a great item, but it's not necessarily something you need in this build. You can keep it as a secondary carry next, on the other side of your crab, but it's not something you need. Seaweed, again, I think is too slow. I don't think you want defensive items. Illuso Ray, I don't know what this item does. It's so slow. I just don't like it. I've never liked it. It has an 8-second cooldown. That's so long. So many things happen in 8 seconds. Pufferfish, again, this is sort of part of its own build. Maybe sometimes going with the Catfish, because they both have, sort of haste themes. I think this is fine. This is actually in a pretty weak place right now. It did just get a big buff. It still doesn't feel that good. Because it doesn't, one-shot, it's trying to ramp instead of come over the top of people, but I don't think you need this along with your depth charge, because it's just another secondary carry. Mantis Shrimp is another thing that I think is just so slow. I don't know what this is doing. One day someone will explain it to me. Shipwreck just got a huge nerf where it increases your item cooldowns by 2 seconds at gold level and then 1 second at platinum, or it's diamond, sorry, and it doesn't give crit anymore. This isn't that good with depth charge anyways, because depth charge is doing multicast. So, if instead of doing 8 or 6 casts, it's doing 7, it's only gaining that 16% damage instead of going from 1 to 2, which is obviously doubling its damage. This is just not something I would play. I think I used to experiment with a little bit pre-nerf. I wouldn't bother. And then Dark Lines is another item I think is good. I use a lot in single weapon builds, but it just comes out a little bit too slow. And it takes 2 slots. It's just not giving me a lot of what I'm looking for. I'd put it in, but this isn't something I'm picking up, and I'm excited about. So I would generally avoid these items. Just your disruption needs to be fast, and you don't need secondary damage. Those are like the 2 keys I'd keep in mind, and then I think sort of the item choices kind of fall into place from there. And then just some quick skills to discuss. There's a ton of skills. Anything that says poison or burn is going to be at least worth looking at. Anything that says haste or charge, worth looking at. Anything that says cooldown reduction, worth looking at. Here are some specifics, though. Draconic Rage, and I think this maybe is a pre-nerf picture. Whenever you use a medium item, one of your burn items gains plus, this is 15. I think it's usually 10 when you get it from the dragon. This is from the dragon fight, which is sometimes a difficult fight, but I think with this build, I usually have good success with versus it. Basically, your depth charge is a medium item. Your depth charge is a burn item. Depth charge will scale itself. You can basically use this as a replacement for crab. Same with configuration. If it's higher level, right? Gaining only 1 burn or even 2 isn't necessarily going to get there. But if it's gaining 2 or 3, sometimes that will be enough. Gaining 10 is definitely enough. One interesting note about depth charge is that if you enchant it, any of the enchants scale off the burn and not the poison. Our build is aimed to increment the poison, but if you get some of these skills, you can, that means your depth charge will enchant a lot better, like the heal or the shield or the damage or whatever. It will scale off that burn that's now being incremented, whereas usually we're just keeping a base level burn. So if you get Draconic Rage, you can basically play this same build with or without the crab, and it will, burn obviously kills really quickly. Then this gets us to our charge stuff. Sick burn, first, 5 to 10 times. You use poison, charge a burn item. Obviously, we can throw some poison items in, but also depth charge itself is a poison item, so it can charge burn item, which it also is. And I'm pretty sure it can charge itself. It's hard to actually tell the behavior of these things, especially multicast items, but I'm pretty sure this charges itself. Otherwise, that's maybe a time to throw in some catfish or jellyfish, add a couple poison things. And remember, you can also enchant something like a dive weights to trigger, if you see like a poison to trigger the burn item. But this is one of the reasons you want to manage how many poisons, slash burn items you have, because if you have multiple burn items, like if you were playing silly little mantis shrimp for some reason, they could eat this charge when you really obviously want it on your dive weights. Slow burn, creeping toxins are pretty similar. The first 5 or 10 times you slow, charge a poison item or a burn item. Obviously, depth charges both. Obviously, Clamra, my favorite item, is going to be a slow item at the beginning of the fight, which teams up great with this. Also, you can work in other slow items, not Illusory, don't play Illusory. These are just great. Again, we're just looking for charge stuff. We'll make those, make the depth charge go off quickly. That's what we're focused on. Paralytic Poison, there's actually a whole series of these that are when you do X, freeze an item. Freezing helps our damage. Freezing disrupts people. Obviously, a lot of these are like when you burn, when you poison, when you crit, when you haste. Because depth charge does a lot of that stuff, because we have a lot of haste being thrown around, because we're going to be playing, maybe other burn or poison items sometimes, depending on our build, these are usually great. So there's a whole slew of them. I don't know all their names, but just, read them. Hyper Focus is the skill you can get off the octopus fight. It's pretty rare to get. It's a very easy fight, but it's pretty rare to get this one because it has so many items to give. It says if you have only one medium item, its cooldown is reduced by 30%. Now, usually in this build, I'm playing 1 to 2 medium items, either playing just a depth charge, in which case this is great, or I'm playing depth charge and figurehead. Figurehead is giving me at max level 30% cooldown reduction, but it's giving it to all my items. So you're going to have to weigh whether or not that's better or worse than, putting 2 small items in its place, getting the extra multicast, and still having the reduced cooldown on your depth charge. But Hyper Focus, if you only have a depth charge, if you don't have the figurehead, this is incredible. So keep an eye out for this if you happen to get lucky. The same with Dragon, right? This is one where if you just happen to high roll, this is just talking about how to play into that high roll. Like, don't expect this. Go looking for, you can look for it. You can certainly take these fights with the intention of trying to get these, but you can't plan around this. Barnacle Crusted is just reducing the cooldown of your aquatic items. You're playing all aquatic items. Tiny Dancer is similar. If you have at least 7 items, your cooldowns are reduced by 5, 10, or 15%. Again, we're looking for cooldown reduction. We're playing usually at least 7 aquatic items, so both of these are amazing. And then again, something like Toxic Injector is pretty similar to like the Paralytic Poison. The first time you use an item, haste 1, 2, or 3 poison items. I think there's a burn version of this as well. Again, Clamor goes off at the beginning of the fight. It hastes your poison item. It hastes your depth charge. So that's, again, one of the reasons I love the Clamor. So keep an eye out for these skills. And that's going to be the end. I mean, this is a pretty simple build. It's incredibly powerful. I've played it, in my last 10 games, I've played it 10 times. I've forced it every game. The only time I didn't get the build, like the full build, was I couldn't find a crab, but I've actually I've gone 10 wins in every one of those games, of my last 10 games forcing this. I think it's going to get nerfed eventually, because it did just get a huge buff, and it does feel a little bit too easy to play, too forcible, too overpowered. It's possible that as the meta changes, as more people unlock the new friend pack, this will become, less powerful. There'll be more builds going around. But right now, I think this is something you can go almost every game and have great results with. I hope this guide was helpful. I did try to keep it a little bit shorter than the last one, which got very, very long. Let me, give me any feedback on the format, on the guide, or if I'm making any mistakes, or if you have different ideas, because again, this is one of those games where it's hard to really tell, how you're doing, because you don't get to see other people's builds as much. You get to see them during the fights, but not, it's not like in real time to adjust. So, thank you for watching, everybody. Hope this was helpful.